And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalition_radio, and of course the original mothership where literally 8 years of programming can be found, coalitionradio.us. Well, in the waning days of the Trump administration, despite COVID, despite the theatrics, despite the rhetoric, despite the protests in Washington, D.C., the real world moves forward. This show has traditionally spent a great deal of time talking about what happens on the border. We often refer to a trip that literally changed my life to Deming, New Mexico, well, just a year or so ago, in which we got to, well, meet folks whose real lives revolved around the border. A lasting friendship has arisen from that, and someone who's been a repeat offender on the show, it's been way too long since he's been on, is, of course, Professor Andy Hernandez of your Western New Mexico University History Department. And what he's always brought us is sort of unique insight, boots on the ground, from a community who the border is an everyday part of their life and will continue to be, despite the, as they say on the TV soap operas, despite the shifting sands of time, despite Meet the New Boss, same as the oldest boss, despite the cast of characters who runs our country from so very far away, both philosophically and geographically, it will continue to be a major part of their life. And so with the change in power kind of happening, I thought it was important that we reconnect with Andy and reflect on, number one, where we are now, where we've recently been, and what impact and import the change administration will have on the United States southern tier. Professor Andy Hernandez, welcome back to the Coalition. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to be back.
First of all, let's catch up with your life. How are things for folks in New Mexico and nearby Mexico with the, as we say up here in the cities, the Rona? How are things and how are people responding?
Raging out of control right now in this area. I don't know if you've seen the national headlines about places like El Paso and parts of New Mexico, but we're very closely approaching or at or exceeding hospital capacity. Record high tolls, and this is true across the international boundary as well. Juarez and some of its surrounding communities are certainly overwhelmed also. And New Mexico has entered its second round of a lockdown for the next 2 weeks in hopes that the numbers might come back under something resembling control.
So is Deming under a complete stay-at-home, behind closed-door orders?
The spirit of the order is a complete lockdown. The reality of this phrasing of the order, though, is that you should avoid anything but unnecessary trips. Retailers are limited to big box retailers. Essential businesses are limited to a capacity of 75 right now, which basically we can send you daily photos of what the queue is like to get into Walmart and that sort of thing. And this is true for most of New Mexico anyway. These lines to get essential supplies and that sort of thing. Essential businesses the number are restricted, but there are still some of those essential services still being performed.
New Mexico has got wonderful small towns literally across the state. And it's such a complex geography that one really has to drive the span of it a few times to try and get a feel for it, for nothing less. How has this impacted the small business community? There's great local restaurants, great small businesses. How has this left them?
It's left them suffering, of course. So New Mexico had limited indoor and outdoor dining capacity before this, and those are now gone for the next few weeks. We ourselves ordered delivery from a local restaurant that we love this past weekend, and the delivery person thanked us because my daughter answered the door and we were the first people that evening had been wearing masks while they made their delivery. So, not only are these businesses suffering, but people are refusing rather to take even a minimal about a precaution to protect the people who are still trying to provide some sort of service for them.
I can prognosticate and babble on about New England. We've got our share of issues like that. But is it reflect? I guess the big question is why. It's such a complex situation with the border and all of that. Why are folks so resistant to that? What's happening?
You've got a few things at play here. Not one of the least being that the United States never should have allowed things like masks to be politicized or basic public health measures to be politicized and subject to endless conspiracy speculation and that sort of thing. It's essentially an infantile view of liberty to say that I have rights and no responsibilities.
Right. Yeah.
To make it more complex, I'm sorry. We're a multiple border community. Deming is a small town. The number of times that people in this community and in surrounding communities make trips to cities like Las Cruces, a community of nearly 100,000 that's considered the big city, or on to El Paso for some services, for bulk shopping and that sort of thing. Those sorts of connections have really contributed to the escalation of infection rates in this part of the country, as well as the fact that people have relatives distributed all along the conduits between these communities.
How about right across the border? Now, again, what's unique to Americans in this part of the country, and we've had this conversation before, but part of your everyday life is that a real day-to-day, I don't even want to call it a cooperation. I mean, an integration, if you will, of communities on each side of the border takes place really as part of normal life. You have a number of students from Mexico who are part of your public school system. How are the communities across on the other side of the border working with this? Are they in the same condition? Is it worse? Is economics have a part in it?
Economics does have a part because the state of Chihuahua, for example, tried to maintain border access for as long as possible so that for Americans, for example, who cross for medical services or prescriptions or that sort of thing. But the state of Chihuahua actually locked down perhaps 2 weeks ago, so just a bit before New Mexico did again. And so you have extremely restrictive access to the border now for commerce, for people visiting families and that sort of thing.
Wow. So the impact of that is felt on both sides equally. I mean, there's the pain quotient that's being shared has got to be just tremendous.
It does. There are, and you had asked earlier specifically about small businesses. A lot of the sorts of restrictions that are in place on the border now are things that affect individuals, because I'm not aware of actual distribution and shipping of manufactured goods, produce, that sort of thing. I'm not aware of any restrictions on those continuing to cross the border, just the one-on-one elements of economics that had continued to go on when possible.
Are your schools distance learning now?
They are. The schools here attempted to run a hybrid model where, in particular, elementary age students and special ed students could still receive the face-to-face instruction that they really needed. But whereas students who were in mainstream programs or who were older were generally limited to virtual education. And now in the last week, since New Mexico's locked down again, even those very small accommodations have ended.
All right. Now, how does that work for children, for young people who across the border? Are from you think about just simple issues that we take so for granted up here in the Northeast, but when you cross borders, issues like internet access, for example, the ability of children on the Mexican border to have the type of Chromebooks and the things that, again, we might take for granted. How is that playing out on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the school district here and school districts in partnership with universities and other rural communities in New Mexico, they really did step up to the degree that they were able to. And so when they received relief funding, a lot of that went into creating internet hubs using schools as broadcast points. And even local entities like the city of Deming, for example, did their best to convert the public library, which was already a hub for internet access in the community, but to also make things like local parks hotspots for internet access as well.
Wow.
So as a practical matter, part of that essentially flowed into Columbus as well,
Right.
with improvement of the school district there as a hub for internet access, and the attempt to create hubs along the border and in cooperation, or at least in coordination with governments in Palomas.
Wow. So
Now,
what you're saying is international cooperation can be had on a very local level without at least some of the drama that we associated with it nationally?
you know, it seems to be that in effect, the fewer hands that are involved, the more the more productive that you can be. But you were here also. Keep in mind the limits of internet. I pay through the nose for 50 megabits of service per second. I pay a rate that you could get gigabit service in most major cities, or maybe a different way to put it is what I pay for is about what you would get in the Howard Johnsons in Topeka, Kansas, as just something
Wow.
where you go and sit in their lobby. So, whether it's high-end access or the most basic access, the rural communities are still far behind what's available in major cities, and that's not even just a New Mexico issue.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I marvel at the cooperation between Columbus and Deming and all that whole hub there. That despite again the winds of time, the sands of time, despite the rhetoric that ordinary folks working with ordinary folks can accomplish what big government seems incapable of. Moving forward now, we're obviously in a transition as well politically. First of all, I've got to ask, what for folks in Columbus or the folks on the other side of the border that you interact with on a regular basis, what is their impression of this kind of terrible moment we're in right now, where the Trump administration? Well, first of all, what do they think of Trump? And I'm sure that's a complex answer, but this whole peaceful transition of power that we're so used to, that is, just being bandied about. What's their reaction to that?
Well, you have to keep in mind that the county that I live in went for Trump, even though
Really?
the broader state of New Mexico went for Biden. And so you have that echoing through various tiers of the community. And so, Day of the Dead is something that we celebrate here, for example, and that's not
Right.
unique to the border. But there's a very specific bread that you either make or buy for your altar to honor your relatives. And my daughter was the one who went shopping at a local panaderia, a local Mexican bread shop, to buy the bread, since, we could make a passable effort at it, but folks, you stick to the professionals for the good stuff.
Yeah.
And they were proudly flying their Trump flags outside of this Mexican panaderia with all of its signs in Spanish and that sort of thing. So this isn't even an issue where you just go and ignorantly blame white voters, or where you go blame voters of certain classes. There was an interesting cross-cultural, cross-ethnic coalition that sealed this county for Trump.
I had the opportunity when I was there. It was the duck parade, and I had the opportunity to meet your local congressman who was marching in the parade, and who was a very friendly, affable fellow until he realized A, my camera was on, and B, when I started to explain to him why I had taken the opportunity to visit Deming, which of course was a direct function of the community's response to the refugee crisis, in which case he instantly grew less enamored of our conversation, and then had that mystical call from somebody who unseen across the street, and as a certain cartoon character would say, exited stage left, or right in his case.
Just knew somebody was calling their name. Well,
Right.
This seat is the congressional seat for this area did actually go to a Democrat in 2018, but she was the most endangered Democrat in Congress, and she lost her seat for re-election. So the seat is now held by a Republican as of this congressional seat. This is the only seat in the New Mexico congressional delegation held by a Republican.
And is there is it economics? I mean, I'm mystified. Given the rhetoric that came out of D.C., I mean, it's just blatant racism. I don't know how else to say it. Some of the things that our president said about Mexican folks was just horrific. So what do you think the attraction was? I'm mystified.
There's going to be a lot of study of this for the next 2 years, and it's going to be interesting to see what conclusions people draw. But ethnicity is very complex in the United States, and you could perhaps we could treat the Cuban American population for a moment as an outlier. Right. South Florida and Miami in that area. They're just hoping that the United States will bulldoze through Havana one day and give them back all the property that was expropriated.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a tangible gain that they hope to receive that Trump was very fluent in speaking in things that they wanted to hear. But if you take a look at some other parts of the border, our county might be quite a bit like, say, parts of the Rio Grande corridor in South Texas, Zapata County, for example, going for Trump as well. And it's a matter of how people are defining themselves. There is from across the 20th century to now, identity among Hispanics is very complex. To what degree do you adhere to your language? To what degree do you identify as white or as a different racial overarching category in addition to your ethnicity? Mm-hmm. And we may well see an interesting cross where those Latinx people who are identifying themselves as white, even when they do hold on to their linguistic roots and things like that, are perhaps those who are more attracted to Trump. Wow.
There's always been this undercurrent from our conversations when you talk about the complex relationship of the of ICE and border agents with the community, because quite frankly, so many people in your community work for, there's a significant number, I should say, of people in the community who work for border enforcement in some capacity or another. You mix in the Trump and ethnic identification. That's got to be I mean, this nation now is characterized by this political no-fly zone that so many people have erected in their communities, in their families, sometimes in their immediate homes. Is that happening in Deming, or are people just going right at it?
Of course, it's happening here. It's happening elsewhere. One interesting, ethnic identity remains so complex. I mean, Biden did outperform Hillary Clinton as a candidate on the number of Latinx people who voted for him. But that doesn't mean that Trump did not also increase his share. Both of those things happen.
Right. And, quite frankly, some of that, and for folks who in your community who may see this show at some time in the near future, I happen to be an active libertarian. I'm involved in the party nationally. Some of that vote actually was taken out of the hide of the libertarian vote from the prior election, where Governor Gary Johnson, the former governor of your state, did relatively well, actually very well for a third party. And part of that was familiarity, and he was kind of the hometown kid. But a significant part of that came out of our backsides, if you will, in New Mexico. A rather unique position, as opposed to us normally being accused of pilfering the votes of other folks. You bring up the Biden administration, and there is, in a sense, the focal point, if you will, for tonight's conversation. The relationship to the border of the former Obama and Biden administration, despite its whitewashing, and I use that term intentionally, is incredibly complex in terms of its real history as opposed to the rhetoric. Now, compare and contrast that, if you will, to the Trump administration, who was so notoriously just anti-Mexican, anti-border, bad hombres, gangs. They're coming to take your children. They're the reason why economically your generation is failing. Border, things like NAFTA and all that. I mean, on and on and on again. This is a complex question. It's can't probably be solved in one conversation, but First of all, let's look at Joe Biden and Barack Obama. What, from your perspective, as someone as boots on the ground, what was your thoughts on their border friendliness, their role in immigration, reality, since you're confronted with it every day, versus that soft rhetoric, that glow that seems to surround them when they were in power initially?
Well, for all of the excesses and even crimes of the Trump administration, the Obama administration still deported far more people attempting to enter the United States or people who had entered the United States than the Trump administration did. So I'm going to have to go back now and take a look just to be sure that we're looking on an annual basis instead of ignoring the obvious that, for example, Obama had 8 years and Trump has had 4. So we can set that aside for a moment. The Obama policies had more of a humane sheen to them in that, for example, the administration had the grace to be embarrassed when its policies were leading towards family separation in 2014, to create humane facilities where people could be held. This is certainly an area where the Trump administration hasn't bothered. But I mean, if there were ever a textbook definition of damning with faint praise, it would be that the highlight of your immigration policy was creating humane holding facilities while you were preparing to deport people in record numbers. And so when we take a look at what the Biden administration is going to be like, the Obama administration did change over time. By 2015, 2016, the number of deportations had been increased. There was a more critical look at the granting of asylum and things like that. So will the Biden administration be more like the early Obama administration, or will it be more like the late Obama administration? Both of those are troubling, but there are different degrees to which they're troubling, whether it's outright inhumanity or whether it is a matter of being extremely regressive in terms of immigration.
At its most superficial level, has COVID had an impact on the overall levels of immigration, both from a refugee status and also folks who, traditionally associated with those, late night river crossings and with the, I'll spare you all the cliches that Donald Trump would weigh into, but what kind of crossing border, what kind of levels of border crossing, should I say, are taking place right now during this period?
They are much lower, and I think that part of the way that we can tell this is that it's been some time, for example, and the Trump administration did not attempt, for example, to hype any migrant caravans in the run-up to the election because there weren't any to hype. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I should have meant that. There were none that had the potential to make it to the United States. Right. Because Trump is often rebuked for his claim that Mexico would pay for the wall when they very clearly did not. But what he was able to do was to get Mexico to pay the human and financial and military and security costs of stopping immigration or limiting immigration severely within their own boundaries. And we had this playing out to a lesser degree in places like Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, where administrations there who were seeking favor with Trump, and more importantly, perhaps, were seeking somebody who would turn a blind eye towards their worst practices, where essentially Trump's support could be bought by taking a hard line on stopping immigration within their own countries.
Right. Now we flash forward, January 20th is just about 2 months away. And where, depending on the whims, if you will, of Donald Trump, if he has to be, my bet, by the way, is that he disappears gently into that good night. They show up one day and it's like that scene from that Matt Damon movie where he's just gone. They showed up at the door and you're left with that empty room and some tattered furniture, and he's out of there. That's my personal prediction. But we've got now the advent of the Biden administration, and under the cover of COVID, there will be unseemly things happening already. And of course, we get to, if you will, the reintroduction to the American body politic of one, I guess her name is Cecilia Munoz. And it described for me what role she played in the original Obama-Biden reincarnation.
So she's frequently described as the architect of Obama's immigration policies and is frequently blamed in particular for the period in which, the brief period in which the Obama administration actually separated families. To some degree, I'm not sure that it's especially fair to single her out when so many people were involved in these policies, but it's troubling that the president-elect would pick her as the poster, as the banner for his immigration advising.
And that has resonated across the immigrant right community, well, across the nation. I'm working to get folks from what they call the Inland Empire in California. I'm hoping those folks will come on. I'd love to have you come on again with them, just because there's again, your insight is so valuable. But I mean, the $1 million question is, you're not even into the first week of your quote unquote, and what's the banner that they've got up in terms of projecting the office of the president-elect? By the way, there is no such, and I'm not a Trumper by any stretch, but there is no such thing as the office of the president-elect. I don't know why they have to play that game, but this is one of your first hires, if you will. This isn't someone they're just burying in some bureaucratic backwater. This is a signal to everyone who pays attention, to the wonk nation, if you will, to the folks who are reading the tea leaves, to the folks who are looking for signals as to what American policy is going to be like on literally everything. These first few hires, am I overreacting? Is this just a quote unquote a pig in a poke, or are people really afraid that this is symbolic of what the Biden administration is going to represent?
It's not, and it actually speaks to an earlier piece of research that I'd done that I'm going to be revisiting this coming spring, because, people will scream deep state out of ignorance.
Right.
The United States has generally had a professional and honest civil service. The issues that we have are with the political appointees who are continually recycled from administration to administration. And the Republicans are certainly some of the worst offenders here, because the folks who cut their teeth on Watergate were still employed during Iran-Contra and got appointed again during the War on Terror and got recycled again during the Trump administration.
Right.
Now, the president-elect, however, seems like he wants to compete here by bringing back a figure like Cecilia Munoz. And so it's emblematic of the larger issue that we don't have a deep state problem. We have elected officials, and the president, of course, is a lightning rod. But if we look at the political appointees in agencies like the State Department, or if we look at political appointees who work with the Senate and Congress and that sort of thing, you do see too many people who were associated with bad policy who are seemingly immortal in their ability to come back and have another attempt to create more bad policy.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of, and again, I'm going to just to keep it a little lighthearted, so we're not thoroughly depressed. It's similar to, and here's a sporting analogy, to NFL coaches. After you wash out of one city, somehow you're considered, you're going to have some career change. And by the way, there's only one or two Bill Belichicks who started out terribly and became geniuses. Again, silly analogy, trying to keep it light here, but is that the same mentality? I mean, it's we can only work with the people we know. We can only, are we rooting for laundry? It's only be the people from our team that we can trust enough to bring on? My God.
Well, there's part of that to it, but there's also an perhaps informal credentialing system that both parties seem to practice to varying degrees. For example, the Federalist Society, of course, is composed completely of unelected officials, many of whom have created varying degrees of bad policy. but can we think of a conservative member of the Supreme Court who did not have the Federalist Society's blessing in order to get their appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court?
You are correct, sir.
We can look outside the judiciary, though. There are different ways where essentially you might go back and use the old phrase, get your union card. But there are ways that people are essentially informally, or perhaps more formally in some cases, vetted and get the imprimatur of having the ability to then be able to take part in the crafting of policy.
But the biggest difference in the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party is that, and I'd love you to debate me on this, the Republican Party had their divorce with the Liberty Movement a few years ago, which became the Libertarian Party, and then the ultimate divorce took place when then Congressman Ron Paul was treated so badly by the Mitt Romneys of the world. Willard Mitt Romneys of the world. And, that divorce became largely finalized. The Democratic Party still has this, and Green Party aside, I mean, I'm friends with a lot of Green Party members. They're not relevant to this conversation because they just seem intent, hell-bent on self-immolation. But if you look within the Democratic Party, you've got this huge rift between the progressive movement, as best represented by the candidacy of one Bernie Sanders, and you've got the conventional, what would have been called years ago Kennedy Democrats, but I'll call them the conventional Democrats now, who seemingly are as equally hell-bent on just driving a stake between them and the progressives. I mean, look at the nomination of the vice president and her record as a drug warrior, and just all in all, not progressive, despite her claims. It's been, organizations like Vox and people have done amazing jobs of vetting her. And now look at Ms. Munoz, and it just strikes me. I mean, the next thing that's going to happen is a Clinton-esque welfare reform or something. What does this speak to the Democratic Party, and how, from your perspective, in a state where the politics are so mangled, if you will, are progressives just going to rise against us, or are they still so afraid of electing a Republican that they'll go along with anything?
Well, the Trump administration has certainly put the fear of God in quite a few progressives. There was a question before the 2016 election: would Trump really be that bad? And so, especially if you're a progressive, 3 Supreme Court justices later, plus immigration policy, plus let's go through the range of policies here. Yes, there are progressives now who are thoroughly immunized, at least for the 2020 election, from voting third party themselves. Mm-hmm. What the Biden administration is doing, though, is an interesting exercise in balance, because they're certainly not selectively leaking. They're broadcasting what the first 100 days might look like. And it's entirely possible that a resumption, or a policy that is centered on deportation, there might be the hope that would be more palatable if it is combined with things like restoring DACA by executive order, if it's paired with things like COVID relief, and in particularly something that would be that would resonate greatly with progressives, but would certainly appeal outside of the party. If the Biden administration moves forward with some sort of student loan forgiveness. And so, this is a strategy that the Republicans have pursued to varying degrees of success as well. You do some things to make your base happy, you do other things to appeal to a larger court. And we're going to be seeing how well the Biden administration tries to balance those interests. And if the appointment of somebody like Munoz as a key advisor really is going to be as terrifying as it looks right now, because it's just hard to look at that appointment as anything but a harbinger of what type of immigration policies a Biden administration would have.
And as important as DACA is, and finally resolving that situation, so that these young people who actually aren't that young anymore, this has been going on for so long, but those young people have resolution in their lives, and they take their rightful place finally in the greater American community. As important that is, it's statistically, and please, again, I'm coming at this from a very much a northeastern perspective. That is, in the greater picture, not that significant a number of people, and certainly doesn't speak to the larger tensions at large, if you will, of the border itself. The fact that we still don't have immigration reform, we still have this hodgepodge of exemptions and qualifications, and we're micromanaging which type of people we want and where they're coming from, and the lotteries and just nonsense. And here we are again. It's 2020, and we still haven't figured it out. No one's taken the hard steps, despite, I believe, Americans of all backgrounds warming to the notion of immigration reform. I mean, again, am I way off here?
Well, not to bring you down further, I'm not sure the Biden administration is actually going to be able to offer a definitive resolution on DACA. It might be better to think of it as a stay of execution, especially if they're only able to act by executive order. Ideally, there would be some compromise that would sail through both the House and the Senate that would create a permanent statutory place for DACA, for those who fall under the DACA program. But, the reality is we've got a couple of decades now, we've got 2 decades now, in which the DACA question's been addressed by executive order, whether it was by Trump executive orders or Obama executive orders or even the initial Bush executive orders. And so I hope that there's a statutory resolution, but there may not be. But most people can look at somebody and say that they know dreamers in their communities. Mm-hmm. It's certainly very true here. I'd be surprised if it wasn't true even in Providence.
I know dreamers.
Most people don't want to believe that federal authorities allegedly tortured Cameroonian asylum seekers before forcibly deporting them to their country where they haven't been heard from since.
Right.
Most people don't want to believe that a doctor in Georgia forcibly sterilized immigrant women. So we have that a bit. We have so many people with the ability to suspend belief in that area, but their acquaintance with people who fall under the DACA category is something that they're not in denial about.
Mm-hmm. And that's the best we can do in the year 2020. I've been listening to these stories my entire life, and such just a failure in character on behalf of American leadership to address situations like this once and for all is. Yet again, here you have a president who was, I believe, was because of the sheer volume of vote differential and the Electoral College, was handed a mandate to fix these things. The American people are speaking. And again, I'm asking you to understand or explain the motives of people that we can't even sometimes are fathomless. But is it simply just a political weakness, or do people of the Joe Biden's ilk, if you will, of that mainstream Democratic Party, really? Do you think they don't really want to resolve the issue? I mean, I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's a question of political will. And I'm hoping that the Biden administration behaves as if it has a mandate, because the Trump administration certainly did. The Bush administration certainly did in 2000. They did not act like they were part of a fragile coalition that had squeaked across the finish line. They acted as if they had a decisive mandate. And so if the Biden administration behaves in the same way and does so convincingly, perhaps we'll see some progress in some of these areas. Kind of a final thought for the night. What are there things that we should be watching in terms of the tea leaves? Are there signals that they're going to make, or do we just kind of sit here and wait until the big announcement, the trumpets blare? Clearly, thank God, it won't come through tweets. That's been made obvious. I think we're all a little exhausted by Twitter storms. We had a local radio station who would signal these Romanesque horns, if you will. Anytime that more than 3 tweets came out in 10 minutes, they'd interrupt programming to do it, half facetiously, half with tongue planted firmly in cheek. Of course, Trumpers reacted by that being an affirmation. Not Trumpers' willingness to suspend the whole notion of irony is rather ironic in and of itself. But what should we be looking for as signals? Will Ms. Munoz take you think, a very public role? Do you think that the progressive community and the immigrant rights community at large is strong enough to head her off?
I don't know that they are, but here's an area that the United States might actually make progress in the next 4 years. And I don't think it will happen, but I would be delighted to see it happen. There have been legitimate crimes committed by people on the federal payroll. I just mentioned the forced sterilizations a minute ago. Mm-hmm. There were forced adoptions. There were families that were broken apart. There were people that were tortured in custody. There need to be investigations and prosecutions and convictions where evidence permits in every single one of those instances. And if I were to see that, I would see that as a favorable sign that not only were we willing to face the past 4 years very squarely, but that would also serve as a break in the event that there were officials in the Biden administration who might believe that under cover of little scrutiny that they might be able to continue mass deportations and those sorts of policies.
That type of national reconciliation was done very dramatically by none other than Nelson Mandela. Does something along that lines need to happen with our entire approach to folks who are here in the United States on an undocumented basis or on a limited refugee basis?
Ideally it would, but I don't really have faith that we would have that sort of national reconciliation. There is a possibility, however, that some of the excesses in terms of U.S. immigration and asylum and deportation policy were so extreme. Some of them walk up to the line of matching the definition of genocide under the UN Convention, of which the United States was a signatory.
Right.
Do we really want, as Americans, to be quibbling and say, well, that really wasn't genocide, it was more of a crime against humanity? That's not really the discussion that a just people want to be having. Mm-hmm. And so there is ample evidence so far, and it would not be a Herculean feat to continue to investigate and verify that evidence and see if there is more, and prosecute the worst offenders of the last 4 years, and simply draw a line and say that this was a low point that we will not cross.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in doing so, that would Americans have such and ironically, it was Donald Trump himself who pointed out at one moment early on in his administration, Americans have such again, I'll use the term whitewashed, sort of rose-colored glasses, if you will, towards our own culpability in any one of a number of generational crimes, from our behavior in Central America in the 60s and 70s, the CIA, all of that. Trump himself pointed out that we're not nearly as, I forget his exact wording, we're not nearly as righteous, I'll use the word, as we think we are. Final thought for the night is, are Americans capable of that type of self-introspection at this point in our history, or are we still just obsessed with chanting USA, USA, and USA, and have we convinced ourselves that we are in fact the white knights of the world, despite all evidence to the contrary, including the droning that's taking place right as we speak?
I think that Americans do have that capability. I think that that if the economy were to tank even worse than it has already, if COVID were to become worse, if there are major issues that will distract attention from facing some of the worst excesses of the last 4 years, then all bets are off and we won't face those. I do think that Americans are capable of facing those things and of saying that there are people who should be punished for their crimes. Under any other context, it's unimaginable Let's pick other things, for example. There's not really a spirited discourse in the U.S. of people saying for small crimes, for example, well, we should just let that one go.
Right.
It's now incumbent on making the case that people guilty of major crimes who might otherwise have claimed that they were just following orders should also be punished for their crimes.
Mm-hmm. And it's ironic and subject for another night, the notion that there was no hiding with Biden on any one of the level of drug crimes. His crime act, which many would argue, in fact, he was the architect, we'll use that term again, that he was the architect of many of the racial issues that we face in our inner cities right now because of his missile-like destruction of the family structure because of the 3 strikes you're out, because of all of those that mood that characterized American criminal justice system, if I can even use that term anymore, as a result of Biden's legislation.
There's kind of a private bet that I have going with myself.
Mm-hmm.
He may be sufficiently scarred from having bought into a very right-wing set of policy options and being punished for doing that perhaps it will make him consider that when an advisor tells him that this is the only thing that you can accomplish, that perhaps he would have the experience and the hindsight to say no. Mm-hmm. But at least on the drug war front, the other thing that came out of 2020 is that perhaps the resolution of the drug war and the beginnings of a stake in the heart for prohibition might come out of the states that are legalizing various drugs. When enough states do so and reach critical capacity, and we'll see what comes out of the next round of legislative sessions across the country, states might be deciding some of these issues on their own.
Right. One can only hope, right? Well, right. One can only pray. Well, Professor, it was outstanding to have you on again. I just can't tell you how much I've missed our conversations. And tonight, you just provided us with a provocative insight into issues to which I say I continually try to explain that regional differences, I believe, have a real impact on one's ability to engage in the type of deep dive that is so necessary. Thanks for joining us tonight, and like I said, we'll be working to get some folks on from a variety of immigrant communities on over the next few weeks, and I hope if you have the time. I know it's a hectic time for you, and we're getting into the holiday season, and you're teaching remotely, and you've got your own family issues to consider because of what's happening, across the nation. I hope we can get together in the next week or two and continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Pat. You take care. It's great to see you again.
Great. And listen, it's be careful. Just be careful. And love, of course, to the Reverend that we often discuss, and much love to the Deming, New Mexico community. I hope there's a time sometime next year that we can have coffee again at a Denny's in the parish, if you will, of southern New Mexico, Deming, New Mexico.
I am definitely looking forward to better days. You stay safe as well.
All right, buddy. That was Professor Andrew Hernandez, he of the Western New Mexico University Political Science and History Department, again, sharing with us his unique insight into some of the most challenging aspects of the new Biden administration. And yes, be afraid, folks. Be very afraid. Well, folks, that's it for tonight. We're going to take our leave as we continue to get back to our roots post-election. We're going to try to continue to enhance our programming at our new facility here in the hills above Providence, Rhode Island. And whether it be folks like Connor DeGotis or Professor Hernandez or Pump Up the Volume or, any one of the number of wonderful shows we have, like Ramp with Tina on earlier this evening, we will continue to work to make a difference both here in Providence and wherever the sounds of this signal are heard. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network. at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, the original mothership, coalitionradio.us, where there are 8 years of interviews and conversations, both provocative and occasionally mundane. We'll have these shows out in podcast format by tomorrow. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon.